Ancient Alexandria smelled like fermenting fish, burning resin, and damp straw, not ocean breeze. The final entry in the harbor ledger of Alexandria records 0 incoming spice vessels for 3 straight weeks. I will explain how a sudden crash in wild civet cat populations 400 miles south stripped the Mediterranean's richest port of its legendary perfume, leaving only stagnant salt mud behind. 3 days before the customs desk went quiet, a senior inspector named Nicias unsealed 80 imported clay amphorae, expecting valuable balsam and frankincense. Instead, he found gray powder. A Nubian merchant confessed the truth. Without civet musk to bind the raw resin during transit, the whole cargo oxidized into dust. A month earlier, intense highland brush fires had driven away the wild civet colonies, whose musk fixative was essential for preserving long-distance shipments. Without that animal secretion mixed into the jars, ocean humidity ruined every ton of resin, severing the supply route that perfumed the entire city. Harbor workers and perfumers stood crowded around the customs quay in total confusion, realizing the sweet air of cinnamon and myrrh had completely dissolved into rotting fish kelp. By dusk, the scribes packed up their reed pens and locked the heavy oak gates, sealing the end of an era. 300 tons of black bitumen dried into the cracks of the great harbor before sunset. The pungent stench hovering over Alexandria at 7 in the evening was not decay. It was a chemical distress signal emitted by millions of foreign hide beetles clinging to wet papyrus cargo. Rewind 3 hours earlier to the height of trade. Workers smashed chunks of Judean asphaltum onto granite docks to seal wooden barges. The resinous dust mixed with bruised Egyptian river reeds, creating a thick, bittersweet vapor that coated the throats of every dock worker on the waterfront. A South Asian merchant named Devendra recorded the cause in his ledger at 4 o'clock. His spice crates had attracted swarms of carpet beetles from foreign ships. When these insects encountered the hot asphaltum fumes, they released massive plumes of quinone defense fluid, transforming the air into something sharp and metallic. By noon, as the first ships docked, thousands of seaside gulls refused to land on the piers. Onlookers watched in silence as flocks drifted high above the smoke, repelled by the pungent, stinging haze. What urban scholars mistook for sacred incense was simply an insect defense mechanism taking over the port. By full dark, the perfume quarter of Alexandria smelled like panicked predators. 5 wild leopards collapsed near the southern gate in 200 BCE, lured straight to the waste drains. This is how that catastrophe unfolded. 20 minutes before closing, merchant Harish tilted heavy copper kettles over shallow stone sinks. A visiting physician recorded that raw cedar resin combined with heated asphalt released volatile terpenes that mimicked big cat territorial markers across 3 miles of open sand. An hour earlier, workers stoked charcoal fires beneath bronze distillation tubes. Extreme heat forced concentrated Syrian cedar oil through cold pipes, filling narrow alleys with a sharp, suffocating mist that hung heavy near the dirt floor. At mid-afternoon, long before the kettles cooled, market guards routinely doubled their patrols along the outer wall. Local shopkeepers knew the clearing had begun not by evening bells, but by pack horses bucking violently against their iron hitches.
Every falcon over Alexandria abandoned the coastline by sunset, settling onto temple ledges instead of the harbor rocks. I will trace back the exact sequence that triggered this sudden avian shift across the Canopic Way. It ends with quiet courtyards, but the cause began hours earlier.
Moments before dusk, the northern sea breeze met warm limestone pavement, lifting heavy airborne oils into private residential gardens. Third-party scrolls from the harbormaster record how these thermal currents carried crushed, roasted coriander seeds straight up into the sky, pulling wild falcons off their maritime hunting routes.
Rewind to late afternoon, when household hearths along the main avenue reached maximum temperature. A visiting Syrian chronicler observed cooks tossing whole coriander seeds onto dry clay pans. The intense heat released volatile linalool compounds, creating a dense scent plume that masked the usual smell of rotting fish from the docks. At 3 in the afternoon, before a single spice grain touched iron, the avenue was just dust and heat. Yet as those roasted notes flooded the air, neighbors opened their wooden shutters to catch the breeze. The whole city changed its pulse, guided by a scent that redirected birds and humans alike. By 4 in the afternoon, the suffocating stench of rotting mackerel vanished entirely from the harbor of Eunostos. Alexandrian shoppers walked past scrubbed stone without covering their faces. Here is how municipal workers erased 20 tons of fish oil in under 15 minutes. 10 minutes prior to this sudden transformation, heavy wooden buckets hit the flagstones. Workers dumped crushed spearmint leaves directly into buckets of cold seawater. The mint oils dissolved fatty fish acids on contact, stopping volatile compounds from evaporating into the hot sky.
Documented observations by Roman naturalists reveal a strange ecological side effect. The combination of mint, menthol, and oxidized fish blood created a scent that overwhelmed the olfactory receptors of local feral mongooses. Instead of scavenging scraps, the animals fled into nearby grain silos, accidentally controlling the city rat infestation. Go back to noon, when 700 traders hawked silver mackerel under a brutal sun, clogging gutters with guts. By 4 o'clock, wealthy Roman buyers returned to the square, astonished as their sandals clicked against spotless granite that smelled like crushed herbs rather than a bloody docks market. In 140 BC, harbor guards in Alexandria scraped a dead peregrine falcon off a high cedar beam inside Vault 4. The bird was petrified, preserved in sticky myrrh dust and aromatic resin fumes. I will explain how this apex hunter turned a locked royal storehouse into its sanctuary. 3 weeks before that discovery, a South Asian clerk named Malhar audited the royal tax ledgers. He noticed 40 pounds of raw frankincense went missing without a single broken door seal. Malhar's strict records revealed that wild falcons were squeezing through high wooden slats every evening at dusk. Tracing the supply chain back to harvest season, heavy shipments of South Arabian resin sat in open clay vats. Concentrated terpene vapors filled the high rafters. Blood-sucking mites could not survive those thick, aromatic fumes, so wild falcons abandoned coastal cliffs to nest inside scented warehouses. When harbor merchants first saw wild raptors swarming the incense roofs, they feared a divine curse. That fear vanished when rodent copulations near the docks collapsed in a month. Ships loaded with valuable spices celebrated the wild birds, leaving high warehouse vents open to welcome their fierce new guardians.
By high noon, starving scavenger birds and feral dogs completely abandoned Alexandria's southern canal wall. They fled a thick, invisible wall of stench that literally blinded their eyes. I will explain how thousands of decaying sea snails created this toxic dead zone in the heat.
2 hours prior, intense midday heat beat down on 50 stone vats lined up along the canal. Inside, tons of crushed murex mollusks sat fermenting in stale lye solution. The rising temperature accelerated decomposition, forcing dense, oily vapor packed with volatile sulfur compounds into the stagnant summer air.
A visiting Syrian chronicler noted in his daily journal that master dyers used wild desert foxes to test potency. When captive foxes began frantically clawing their wooden cages to escape the fumes, artisans knew the rotting brew had reached the exact threshold required to dye royal garments.
At dawn, fishermen had dumped mountain-high mounds of living shellfish onto hot paving slabs. By mid-afternoon, wealthy merchants in distant residential quarters tightly bolted their cedar doors, while local street sweepers pressed thick cloths soaked in sour vinegar over their noses to endure the haze. The entire central district fell completely silent the moment golden sparrows vanished from the clay rooftops. I will explain how these tiny birds secretly engineered Alexandria's most recognizable neighborhood smell. It all came down to massive stone ovens burning crushed olive stones. Rewinding 6 hours before the silence, thick, nutty vapor floated past the massive Delta grain elevators. Bakers loaded hearths with compressed olive pits from oil presses rather than wood. This cheap fuel released a dense toasted aroma that settled heavy over residential streets. A Syrian spice trader named Jarrah finally uncovered the hidden biological mechanism. Thousands of wild songbirds colonized the brick chimneys, hunting beetles that lived in stored olive waste. As heat forced the birds to preen, oil from their feathers dripped into the updraft, sweetening the smoke. Years before this habit formed, morning air held only the harsh odor of wet Nile mud and raw wheat. Townsfolk who first smelled the nut smoke assumed wealthy nobles were burning expensive imported resins, unaware that humble bakeries were responsible. When neighbors finally realized wild songbirds were refining the neighborhood scent, public reaction changed instantly. Citizens gathered on stone terraces every single morning just to breathe in the avian-enriched smoke, turning a functional bakery routine into a cherished city ritual.
By 1 o'clock, 30 Arabian pack camels collapsed simultaneously across the sun-scorched harbor plaza of Alexandria. The beasts refused to move, nostrils leaking thick mucus from acute aromatic overload. Here is how this entire multi-million drachma trade fleet collapsed, traced backward from its total standstill. 30 minutes earlier, tired handlers stretched yellowed linen canopies over dusty limestone pavers. Bitter resin dust hung suspended in the stagnant heat. Overloaded burlap sacks split open against iron studs, dropping raw frankincense crystals that ground into a suffocating piney powder under heavy wooden wagon wheels. 2 hours prior at the gates, an old Nubian scribe unlocked the secret cause. He spotted thousands of desert blister beetles swarming inside the fresh resin sacks. The insects were secreting acid into the raw sap, turning ordinary incense smoke into an aggressive nerve irritant for big animals. By 2 o'clock, surrounding merchants abandoned their stalls in quiet horror. Nobody reached out to salvage the sticky golden piles melting onto hot cobblestones. Citizens covered their faces with wet wool rags, retreating behind bolted cypress doors, while 30 massive pack animals lay helpless under the scorching afternoon glare. Thousands of wild geese descended onto the eastern harborfront of Alexandria, intoxicated by a sharp green fragrance that completely crushed the salty ocean breeze. I will now explain how thousands of sliced river stalks created this overwhelming avian chaos right in the heart of the ancient world's largest paper factory. 3 hours before the animal swarm hit, Roman cargo captains logged an unusual spectacle in their official harbor ledgers. A Greek warehouse manager recorded that evaporating papyrus sap released rich botanical sugars into the humid air, drawing thousands of migratory waterfowl directly from distant river marshes straight into crowded city streets. By noon, long rows of sun-baked workers stripped tough outer rinds from thick green stems under intense heat. Sliced white pith laid out on woven palm mats exhaled a dense, heavy aroma of freshly cut meadow grass and sticky river mud, soaking deep into limestone walls and overpowering nearby perfume shops. At dawn, Heavy wooden carts hauled dripping reed bundles straight from coastal wetlands into the artisan quarter. Local merchants covered their faces to block the bitter juice splashing off cartwheels, entirely unaware that this pungent morning stench would turn their quiet market square into a deafening wildlife refuge by nightfall.
By 10 in the morning, the royal sanctuary reeked of sharp vinegar instead of holy perfume. I will explain how 3 tons of pure Arabian myrrh ended up ruined by a single species of desert ant before the daily prayers even began. Rewind 1 hour. At 9 o'clock, royal scribes sat at dusty limestone tables near the harbor, logging wicker baskets filled with dark amber pellets. They weighed every sack on iron scales, completely oblivious to the thousands of live red ants trapped inside the sticky resin lumps. Stay fully audible to sunrise. A South Asian merchant named Devendra stood by the docks, pointing a brass rod at a broken resin lump. He revealed the secret to an arrogant clerk. Tree harvesters did not pick this top-grade myrrh from bark, but dug it straight out of desert ant colonies. These ants had collected the tree sap to disinfect their underground chambers, inadvertently crystallizing the pure resin into uniform beads. Dock workers and passing citizens stared in utter disbelief as the head scribe crossed out the royal supplier's name on his tablet and officially recorded the harvest under the name of desert ants. Migrating seahawks shifted their ancient flight corridors over the Mediterranean basin, climbing hundreds of meters to catch thermal columns smelling of burnt resin. Researchers studying avian migration patterns uncovered this radical adjustment in historical flight paths. The exact mechanics behind this airborne shift started with massive coastal fires. Paleoecologists analyzing ancient raptor pellets found resin microparticles embedded inside fossilized bones. These birds were not simply passing through the sky. They actively sought out the warm, rising air generated by Alexandria's massive public altars and incense workshops, riding updrafts that smelled like sweet balsam.
A 3rd century scholar from Rhodes documented this behavior in detailed field records. He noticed that seahawks hovered in rigid formations directly over the city's spice-burning districts. Daily operations processed tons of imported resins, creating superheated air pockets that lifted heavy raptors without forcing them to flap their wings. Merchant sailors approaching Egypt watched these soaring hawk clusters from miles out at sea. Mariners relied on the unusual density of gliders as living compasses, pointing straight toward the invisible harbor long before land appeared. The burning pulse of urban market fires had completely reshaped the local sky.
By the middle of the 2nd century, the southwestern border of Alexandria ended at a wall of rot so intense that imperial tax collectors refused to cross it. I will explain how thousands of rotting cattle hides and lime pits formed a permanent sensory boundary that even sea breezes could not erase. Step back 3 days before those hides hardened into armor. A visiting Greek physician noted an extraordinary sight along the marshy lakefront. Packs of wild desert dogs lived inside the tanneries. Workers gathered dog dung in wicker baskets, using its sharp enzymes to break down dense collagen in raw leather. Stay fully audible to the morning preparation inside the pits. Slaves hauled heavy sacks of powdered oak bark, crushed chalk, and slaked lime. They stirred the mixture with ash ores until chemical heat bubbled without fire, creating a burning gray foam that dissolved hair and flesh from cow skins in minutes. Before any leather touched the chemical vats, workers rinsed fresh animal carcasses directly in the lake. Nearby fishermen pulled up empty nets as toxic runoff blackened the shoreline. The dead fish drifted onto the mud, turning the city outskirts into an unapproachable wasteland that kept unwanted travelers away.
The ancient city smelled of crushed venom by 9 at night. Subterranean olive presses in Alexandria did not just release a sharp, peppery aroma, they smelled of panicking desert vipers. I will explain how oil production turned underground vaults into a reptilian trap. An hour before 9, heavy basalt wheels ground tons of dark olives into raw paste. The massive friction generated intense subterranean heat inside the sealed stone vaults. That sudden thermal surge woke hundreds of cold-blooded vipers hiding deep within the limestone foundation crevices. A senior temple scribe named Harith logged the true cause in his papyrus record. The pungent green oil attracted swarms of black rats from the harbor docks. The vipers simply followed their prey, descending through drainage shafts directly onto the crushing floor. At sunset, harvest crews loaded heavy jute sacks into the dark subterranean vaults without checking the contents. The freshly picked fruit carried dozens of field mice, which triggered a predatory cascade before the night shift even started their heavy machinery. Night peddlers standing above the stone street grates inhaled the thick, peppery vapor with deep satisfaction. They praised the rich aroma of Alexandria's finest harvest, entirely oblivious to the floor of snakes thrashing beneath their sandals. By mid-morning in ancient Alexandria, thousands of migrating Mediterranean swallows regularly crashed dead onto the sun-baked limestone quays of the Great Harbor. Harbor masters routinely recorded these mass avian strandings every autumn. I will explain how a single naval cargo transformed the sky into a lethal trap. A Greek physician named Artemidorus documented the cause in 32 AD. He realized that raw Cilician pine pitch released concentrated alpha-pinene gas into the air. This toxic vapor density completely blinded the magnetic navigation systems of migratory birds, causing them to plummet uncontrollably from 60 feet. 2 hours before the birds fell, 50 sweat-drenched dock laborers levered massive cedar casks off Phoenician merchant freighters. They pounded iron wedges into oak hoops, accidentally splitting 3 barrels and spilling over 50 gallons of boiling black resin directly onto the burning stone quays. At dawn, before the first barrel even landed, surrounding fishmongers and foreign merchants pressed thick wool rags against their faces. The overpowering mountain pine vapor eradicated the smell of brine, forcing shocked crowds on the harbor promenade to cover their eyes and retreat into the inner alleys. By 9 in the morning, Alexandria's eastern harbor turned emerald green, choked with thousands of blue crabs crawling onto stone piers. I will explain how 600 liters of bath oil and natron salt triggered this wild aquatic frenzy along the waterfront. An hour earlier, Harbor Inspector Marcus logged a thick white foam bursting from stone sewer arches. His records documented how alkaline natron salt and rancid olive oil rushed into shallow coastal waters, violently shifting the local water chemistry. Rewind to 5 in the morning inside the royal baths. Attendants dumped heavy wooden pails of raw natron salt over damp marble benches, furiously scrubbing away yesterday's body grime before flushing stone halls with boiling mineral water. At 4 in the morning, the sweep began beside caldarium furnaces. Workers unsealed bronze plugs of heated oil pools, discarding 50 gallons of scented sediment into subterranean drains, sending an oily plume straight out toward the waiting sea. Surrounding fishmongers and dock workers gathered at the harbor steps in total shock, scooping up hundreds of disoriented crabs with bare hands. The daily bath sweep had transformed the harbor into Alexandria's most chaotic morning seafood market.
By dusk, 4,000 red-billed gulls completely coated the granite breakwater in a blinding layer of white guano, neutralizing the rotten stench of fish offal. I will explain how this feather barrier saved the port from suffocating. The entire city accepted the birds not as pests, but as an invisible respiratory filter.
2 hours earlier, at midday, butchering stations along the outer mole processed 3 tons of bluefin tuna. Blood ran into stone gutters. An inspector named Arjun noticed a strange phenomenon. Where gulls crowded near the guts, the pungent sulfur stench vanished, replaced by a sharp, clean scent of ammonia and ocean spray.
At dawn, before the first fishing vessels unloaded their nets, the seabirds were already waiting on the stone ledges. Fishermen dumped fish heads into the shallow water. The gulls reacted instantly, diving down in thousands, their wings beating the air into a cool, salty draft that pushed foul shore air away. Sailors stepping off incoming merchant ships expected the putrid reek of a crowded metropolis. Instead, they filled their lungs with crisp, ozone-rich wind swept across the rocky mole. The crowd on the quay smiled, unaware that the fresh coastal breeze was maintained entirely by thousands of wild birds feeding on offal. By sunset in 27 BC, a calcified white crust choked the eastern marshland outside Alexandria, killing 300 hives of wild carpenter bees in a single evening. I will explain how 4 dry acacia furnaces caused this catastrophe 3 miles away before the first molten glass even cooled. 2 hours earlier, glassmaker Artemon noticed his workers coughing from an unusual mineral sting. The acacia logs brought from the southern scrubland were infested with whistling thorn ants. When thrown into 900-degree heat, their dried resin pockets exploded, releasing sulfurous calcium fumes into the coastal wind. At dawn that morning, Bedouin woodcutters had cleared 20 acres of ancient acacia trees along the desert edge. They specifically sought trees hollowed out by wood-boring beetles because the dried beetle frass burned twice as hot, allowing glassmakers to liquefy silica sand 40 minutes faster than standard pine charcoal.
When the dry mineral smoke settled over the harbor district, scent merchants shut their shutters in disgust, while glassblowers celebrated the crystal-clear beads emerging from the glowing pots. The stench of burned resin and dead insects lingered over the city walls long after the fires died down. By 7 in the morning, 3,000 wild marsh ibises routinely swarmed the eastern stone archway of Alexandria, completely blinding the market guards. I will explain how 40 cartloads of bruised wild celery and split sugar melons triggered this massive animal invasion every single morning.
Rewind 30 minutes to 6 o'clock. Heavy bronze-plated gates swing open with a sharp groan. Cold limestone walls immediately unleash a trapped, pungent wave of bruised garlic stems, sharp wild celery leaves, and warm fruit juice into the humid coastal air. An hour before dawn, a Greek toll inspector named Timon recorded the real catalyst. Heavy iron-bound cartwheels grinding over wet limestone crushed thousands of fresh celery stalks, releasing concentrated herbal oils that drifted miles across the salt marshes. At midnight, 3 miles outside the ramparts, 70 farmers stacked their wooden wagons. Fermenting sap leaking from sliced melon rinds acted like an irresistible chemical signal, luring thousands of hungry wetland birds out from the dark delta reeds.
When iron bolts finally slid back at sunrise, market traders dropped their baskets in shock as thousands of white wings slammed through the dark archway, turning a routine vegetable delivery into a wild, screeching frenzy of scent and feathers.
By midnight, thousands of roosting cormorants would completely abandon the limestone breakwaters of ancient Alexandria. They fled into total ocean darkness every winter night without fail. I will explain how a simple patrol fire lit by dock guards triggered this massive avian exodus.
Harbor logs written by Greek scribes confirm that no footstep or shout ever disturbed these birds. Instead, a heavy cloud of scorched iodine and bitter marine resin rolled across the quay. To endure the freezing Mediterranean frost, night watchmen burned massive piles of sun-dried bull kelp. A local scholar recorded that this brown algae stored concentrated sulfur and salt in its tissues. When tossed onto glowing iron braziers, the charred weed released an intense, oily plume. The pungent vapor stung human eyes and instantly penetrated avian feathers. To the birds, this bitter smoke mimicked the toxic stench of underwater volcanic vents. They misread the smell as an environmental disaster. Instinct forced them to abandon their nests, choosing the pitch-black sea over the polluted harbor air.
At sunset, before the shift began, the harbor smelled only of wet timber and sea salt. But as green kelp smoke blanketed the stone piers, sleeping sailors wrapped wool coats over their faces while thousands of wings thundered into the night. By sunrise, schools of harbor porpoises were leaping frantically away from the royal docks, their acoustic navigation disrupted by dense essential oils floating on the tide. I will trace this ecological chaos back to its exact midnight origin.
2 hours before first light, a local fisherman dragged his nets onto the slippery stone quay. Instead of fresh fish, his wooden basket held dead mullet, coated in a sticky red sheen that smelled overpoweringly of crushed balsam. The ancient chronicle records that an off-duty Nabatean navigator sitting on the seawall raised the first alarm. He recognized the heavy aroma bleeding through the hull planks as raw resin, smuggled past customs officers without declaring cargo. At midnight, the merchant vessel had glided into the dark port without a single torch lit on deck. Her internal cargo of cracked clay jars had shattered during the storm, filling the lower bilge water with concentrated resinous sap. When the vessel tied its lines to the basalt mooring bollard, the bilge pumps flushed the liquid directly into the bay. Watchmen standing along the stone ramparts dropped their wooden spears, stunned by a sudden sweet perfume rising from the Black Sea. Alexandria's most powerful perfume syndicate collapsed because of 300 wild falcons nesting on high warehouse ledges. I will explain how these birds exposed a massive spice operation before dawn. The end of a merchant monopoly began not in court, but on cold stone roofs. Step back 2 hours before sunrise. Tax Registrar Julian of Gaza climbed the granary towers to inspect grain seals. Instead of rat droppings, his oil lamp revealed thick gold trails of raw ginger and wild cardamom powder dusting every falcon nest along the eastern seawall. The falcons did not eat spices. During midnight hunts over the bay, the birds swooped past unlit smuggling vessels hiding in heavy fog. Microscopic droplets of concentrated essential oils escaping from open cinnamon crates below bound instantly to the protective oil coating on the bird's feathers. When morning light hit the port, dock workers no longer checked incoming ship manifests. They simply pointed up at the soaring raptors. Every dive toward a specific warehouse roof signaled exactly which merchant house had received untaxed eastern cargoes under cover of darkness. 300 singed fruit bats washed onto the royal breakwater of Alexandria by sunrise. The harbor guard chief logged the event as a divine curse, but the true culprit was simple chemistry. I will explain how cheap Egyptian sesame oil transformed routine night patrols into a fatal attraction. 3 hours earlier, midnight sentries trimmed 16 coarse wicks along the dark granite seawall. A thick, nutty haze of burning sesame seed oil drifted over the dark water. Harbor logs from 145 BCE confirmed that this dense smoke smelled like toasted grain, easily masking the foul stench of decay. Alexandrian physician Herophilus recorded what the guards failed to realize. The roasted, nutty aroma chemically mirrored the aggregation pheromones of desert locust swarms. Migrating bats crossing the dark sea mistook the lighted breakwater for a massive insect feast, diving headfirst into the open bronze lantern flames. At dusk, harbor merchants had celebrated the sesame oil because it burned longer than imported olive oil. By morning, stunned dock workers and foreign sailors gathered around the piles of fallen wings, whispering nervous prayers while sweeping black ash and dead creatures directly into the harbor tide. 500 cargo certificates sat stacked on the harbor quay at dawn, untouched by damp rot or salt air. I will show you how this massive trade apparatus depended entirely on a tiny winged insect working miles away in the desert oases. 3 hours earlier, inside the windowless harbor office, 6 tired subordinate clerks scraped reed pens across dry sheepskin parchment, the air thick with the warm, honeyed scent of burning beeswax tapers, flickering against stone walls as waves crashed outside.
Before those candles lit the night, an inspector from Rhodes discovered why Alexandrian scribes refused cheap tallow oil. Melted Egyptian beeswax coated the parchment margins, acting as a natural chemical repellent against hide beetles that usually devoured stored harbor receipts in weeks. At the start of the chain were wild desert honeybees harvesting resin from acacia trees. Without their specific biochemical secretion, the entire bureaucratic archive of Mediterranean trade would have crumbled into dust before the ships even cleared the lighthouse. Foreign merchants arriving at the docks breathed in the faint aroma of honey and smoke lingering on their cargo receipts. They smiled with relief, knowing this distinct scent was the ultimate guarantee that their tax records were indestructible. Look at the harbor basin at 5 in the morning. The air smells completely neutral, like fresh salt and crushed limestone. You would never guess that 2 hours ago, this exact water reeked of rotting tuna fish and rancid sesame oil. Here is how 30,000 silver mullets cleansed an empire's busiest port before sunrise. Stay fully to 4 in the morning. A nocturnal scholar standing on the breakwater notes a sudden bioluminescent shimmer along the granite foundation. The sea is turning white. Millions of gray mullet are surging up from the deep bay, following the thermal shift of the outflow. They do not come for oxygen, they come to feed. Rewind 30 minutes further into the dark. On the lower wooden pilings, tons of crushed purple murex shells and discarded animal fat hang trapped in green algae. As the cold Mediterranean tide surges inward, it lifts this heavy paste off the wood. The mullet strip the pilings bare, devouring the greasy residue in minutes. At 3 in the morning, the dock workers dumped their final cartloads of waste and left. They never built drainage pipes or hired night scrubbers. They relied entirely on the tide and the appetite of wild fish to scrub the timber clean. By sunrise, local fishermen watched the crystal water reflect the clear sky without a trace of decay.
By 5 in the morning, ancient Alexandria did not smell like a royal capital. It reeked of acidic bird droppings baked into cold, damp stone. I will show you how thousands of roosting cormorants hijacked the city's famous fragrance long before a single merchant opened a shop.
Rewind 2 hours to 3 a.m. Official Roman records blamed dirty city drains for the sharp odor, but Greek physician Galen recorded the actual source. Thousands of seabirds nested directly inside unsealed clay amphorae containing raw myrrh on rooftop terraces. Their intense body heat melted the dry resins overnight. Go back further to midnight. Pounding ocean winds forced dense salt spray into open granite warehouses. The roosting birds digested fish while resting on coarse burlap sacks of imported cinnamon. Their acidic droppings reacted with wet bark, unleashing a pungent, sulfurous oil mist through dark stone alleys. At 10 p.m., night guards locked the heavy copper harbor gates, believing the precious spice cargo was safe. Yet when shopkeepers unlocked the doors at sunrise, they coughed and covered their faces in disgust. A wild avian horde had secretly transformed the urban air while the metropolis slept.
By sunrise, the provincial governor signed an order seizing 40 barrels of expensive spikenard oil. Here is how a routine odor report destroyed a massive smuggling ring in less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes earlier, a senior scribe unrolled a fresh papyrus document inside the stone council room. He did not read out coin counts or hole dimensions, but the exact smell notes logged at the harbor gates. A veteran dockmaster stepped forward and delivered the critical revelation to the table. He pointed out that the frankincense smelled of vinegar because desert weaver ants had nested inside the raw resin sacks during transit. 3 days before the report reached the desk, inspectors noticed millions of these tiny insects swarming the ship holds. The ants consumed the animal fat seals, releasing formic acid that completely ruined the perfume chemistry. Inside the warehouses, those same ants transformed luxury aromatics into worthless sour sludge. The governor realized corrupt merchants were trying to pass off insect-damaged goods as royal-grade ointment. Outside the grand archway, gathered merchants watched in silence as soldiers dragged away their entire shipment. Their profitable deception collapsed the instant the crowd caught the sharp vinegar scent wafting from the open doors. Smells disappear, but stories stay. I pull these ancient details out of forgotten dust every week, so subscribe and hit like to catch the next journey with me.